So thank you. So here we have the cast and creative. So why don't you go down the line and introduce yourselves and let us know what role you play in the show.
I am Lauren Yalengo Grant, and I am in the King's Company and Ensemble.
I'm Peter England. I'm scenic designer and projection designer.
Hello, Gavin Robbins. I'm the movement director for King Kong.
Hello, I'm Carmen Pavlovich, and I'm the producer of King Kong.
I'm Sonny Childers, and I'm the creature designer of King Kong.
My name is John Hosch. I'm one of the voodoo puppeteers for King Kong, and I'm also the voice of King Kong.
Great. So King Kong was first introduced in 1933 by filmmaker Marion C. Cooper. The story continues to be told in different variations, and now King Kong has taken over Broadway, first time ever on stage. So who came up with the initial idea of, I think a King Kong should be on stage? Where did this start?
Well, I think the answer ultimately depends on whether King Kong's a success or not. If it is, I'm going to say it was my idea. And if it's not, I'm going to say it is Peter England's idea. Full disclosure, we're married. And when we were setting up Global Creatures back in 2007, we were in London and thinking about ways that we might use this extraordinary animatronic capability that Sonny Childers here is the brains behind. And Sonny and his team had built lifelike dinosaurs for an earlier production of ours called Walking with Dinosaurs. And I was about to kind of set up this company, and I was thinking about ideas for how we might utilise this for another theatrical show. And so Pete and I were in our apartment in London chatting about ideas. And in many respects, it's not a great leap to come up with the idea of doing King Kong when you're thinking about how you might utilise that kind of animatronic technology. On the other hand, as soon as we kind of went, would that be a crazy idea? What started to dawn on us was the possibilities of storytelling, because Walking with Dinosaurs had been an arena show, and what King Kong lent itself to, of course, because it's such an epic myth, and it's a production of such scale that we thought music could have a really interesting role there. And so we asked ourselves this question about whether or not the show could exist in a more traditional proscenium style theatre. And so from there we started this really kind of quite bizarre process of what I call proof of concept, where Pete and Sonny had to really think about, well, if we put a creature that size in a limited space of a theatre, how does he get on and off? How does he do that in an interesting way where we're not seeing him just sort of shuffle into the wings? Can he fit in the wings? Sonny, can you make sure that when he swipes his arm that he's not going to knock out the whole ensemble? And could Sonny create something where he could scratch his nose or beat his chest without putting a fist through his sternum? And Pete, of course, had to think about, well, once that creature's taking up the space, how do I put a set in there, etc. So that's how we began.
And was it always going to be a musical, or maybe a play, or what made you want to put music and dance with it as well?
Well, sorry, I won't answer every question, but I will just take this one. So we knew because of scale that music, because of obviously its capacity to evoke emotion, and it was very important to us, and I'm sure you'll hear more from Sonny and Gavin in terms of Kong as a creature, and a creature that we connect with. It was a very important part of our development that we weren't making a kind of robotic creature that you'd expect to see at a Universal theme park ride or something, that we actually were making a creature that could be part of a story that moved you and helped you use your imagination as an audience member. We didn't think, oh, let's make King Kong the Musical because, let's be frank, that sounds quite comedic. We just nonetheless thought that music was just going to be important to give us scale and emotion. And as time went on, one thing we really wrestled with in the creative development was that we had this extraordinary creature who really did work and function as a character on stage interacting with humans, but we just kept feeling like no matter what we did, this creature was plonked in the middle of someone else's musical. And eventually we realised that we had to honour this incredible conceit that Sonny and the team and Gavin had come up with of Kong being operated by puppeteers and humans move him around and breathe life into him. And that idea, if we pulled it through the entire show, would give us the kind of cohesion we'd been looking for. So it kind of got me thinking that the pages of this particular story really needed to be turned with a physical language to match Kong's. So then we started working with Drew McOnie because he's a choreographer and a director, and his kind of idea was to have a cast that could puppeteer the whole set through movement, and that became really fundamental to the whole musical identity of the piece as well. Because of course this sounds so simple and obvious now, but we didn't initially really get to grips with the fact that King Kong is the leading character in a musical, but he can't sing and he can't speak and he can't dance. And as much as people always say, oh, does the monkey sing? He doesn't sing. And so we needed to find something in the language of the storytelling that really paid deference to the type of performer he is. So went the music.
When Cooper made that film in 1933, it was really the first Western, at least, movie with a purpose-built score. And so it has a musical identity that is kind of critical to a lot of what that movie's success was. And being such an epic, almost like legendary, mythological type tale, a Beauty and the Beast kind of archetypal fear of monsters, and journeying from, one empire, New York City, to this fallen empire and this sort of mythical island, giant boat trip and climbing up a mountain and coming back to New York City and then climbing the tallest point, the Empire State Building. There's something about that storytelling which is verging on operatic. Mm-hmm. And music is one of the great kind of international languages of storytelling in a way, and it supports that epic journey perhaps better than simple words would do. Mm-hmm. So I think that's just, part of the drive of the production is a musical language, as opposed to being a musical.
And the story is set it was created in 1933, and your story is set in 1933 too. Was there any thought about making it contemporary or putting it in the 21st century?
In that a modern audience needs to take something away which means something to them, but not in contemporizing it to put it like Dino De Laurentiis did his 1976 film and set it on the Twin Towers, and he was going for a very contemporary angle on the story. For us, the idea of 1933, the Great Depression, the building of the Empire State Building in 13 and a half months, these sorts of things are really at the heart of the sort of story that we've been trying to tell, which is about a gritty courage and ambition that defies the odds. And there's something about that period in this city that captures it in a very poetic way.
Mm-hmm. I might add that when we were first thinking about this show, it was 2008 when we were doing our creative development, when that process began. And we were about 6 months in, I think, when you had the financial markets crash here, which spurned on the global financial crisis. And we were so struck by it because, of course, through our development process by day, we were researching New York of 1933 and the Great Depression. And then, I often say, my God, at night, our televisions were on with news broadcasts, and all anyone was talking about was this financial scale crisis not seen on a scale since the Great Depression of the 30s. And I just thought, wow, this story does need to be told. And in thinking about what stories one might put on the stage, there has to be a reason to do it. And you might kind of notice if you consume arts editorial at the moment, there's a lot of frustration on behalf of a number of reviewers of films just being plonked on stage. Mm-hmm. And of course, Kong is not just a film, it's one of the great myths of this century. It exists and originally it was a novella in 1932 that came out as a publicity tool for the film. And of course, it's been told in many forms since. And so the question we asked ourselves is what can this story say that's new to an audience today? And, well, at the time we didn't think it was going to take 10 years to realise the production, but along the way, every step of the journey, what's been really particularly noticeable to me is that there's something that's always relevant in current events of the day. So King Kong essentially is about a story about a Beauty and the Beast. Historically in this country, it's really had a lot of debate and thinking about racial overtones and subtext in the piece, so we had to think about that. Of course, there's climate change. There's the idea of the other, which is a really important part of our storytelling. And of course, you know, we have a filmmaker, Carl Denham, who's threatening to crush a young actress if she doesn't do what he wants to do, because he's one of the most powerful producers on Broadway, apparently. And so, of course, we were reading these audition scenes. Having these scenes read during auditions at the time that the Harvey Weinstein scandal broke. And I just thought, wow, here we go again. Like, everything we do around King Kong seems to find a relevance in what's happening today. Yeah. So that was important to us, but we really felt rooting it in a 1933 period was important, because to us it really spoke to it started to answer the question of why something that was created in 1933 still has something relevant to say to audiences today. Mm-hmm. But we wanted to not have it feel like a very kind of traditional musical, so it was important to us that we found a language that honoured the 30s but still had it feel like there was a level of innovation and something kind of contemporary that you could see in the whole aesthetic of the piece that carries through the music as well.
And so, Sunny, you are the creator, the designer of this. So I read King Kong the puppet is 20 feet tall and he's 2,000 pounds. Where does one begin to design something of that size?
It's certainly an evolution, and as Carmen described, we really evolved this out of Walking with Dinosaurs, and I think the instinct was probably to do something like Walking with Dinosaurs, where we made these, you know, lovely, very realistically wrought creatures, and that's where we started. And we thought, well, I'll just, you know, make this lovely robotic thing, and we'll try and get that sublime realism that we saw in the Peter Jackson film of 2004, and I thought that would be a thrill to get that level of animatronics on the stage. But then we realised it would sort of be a bit of a rod for our backs, not least, like, how do we make this, what would be probably a substantially heavier piece of equipment, work on stage safely? It'd be like having an earth digging machine on stage with actors. Like, you wouldn't let anyone near it. So that kind of killed that idea. And then, you know, working with Pete on the production design side of things, it was clear that Pete's not going to make, you know, a slavishly realistic version of New York. He's going to use all the tricks of theatre, and it really dawned on us that it made no sense to do something so realistic. Now, people say Kong's realistic, but he is quite aesthetically different, or pushed, if you like. His proportions are quite superhero proportions. He doesn't have fur. He has a bunch of these things that we wanted to take him somewhere else, so that the audience is doing a bit more work rather than just sitting there passively and watching something so realistic.
You say that he doesn't have fur, because I could have swore he did. Like, being in the audience and seeing him, like, it just seemed so lifelike.
Yeah, and the fur was one of those things. As soon as we put fur on him, he started to look far too realistic again, and we tried all sorts of different versions of string and shade cloth, and whenever we did it, it just looked like a shaggy dog. Okay. And we had this lovely sculptural form as a sort of a mannequin to try out these various surfaces. Mm. And the sculptural form was made of these muscle bags. And one of the sort of lovely things that we do as a company at Creature Technology is to try and make creatures look as sublimely real as possible. And that is about making anatomical layers. So the skin of dinosaurs, usually scaly skin, would sit on this muscular understructure. Yeah. And so we'd always cover this muscular understructure that would stretch and contract and change shape like real muscles do. And we'd pin up all this sort of fur and then take it off and then just sit back and admire this incredibly strong muscular form and go, oh, that's kind of it. Mm-hmm. Like, this kind of epitomises what Kong needed to be, this incredibly powerful manifestation of masculinity, and but there's something kind of lovely and vulnerable about the rawness too of not having a surface. And so I think what Kong has become is this sort of moving sculpture, and all these muscles connect seamlessly. And but the trick is it's a marionette puppet, so none of the joints could have friction. We need this freedom of movement with a marionette puppet, because essentially it's strings that hold up the arms, and they need to be manipulated by performers as well. So there are a bunch of sort of technical challenges to work through. But the decision to have him hairless was kind of, again, evolved out of this thinking about, well, we just got to remove him from this slavishly realistic thing. Because I think with a puppet, the form and the aesthetic has to match the movement. Mm-hmm. So, and there was a concern going back to the idea of making it like a really realistic robot, is that we'd probably get it 90% right, but that 10% would be the difference between people believing it or not. So the marionette's very traditional technique, with a less realistic aesthetic. I think those two ideas work well together.
Yeah. And so, Gavin, you choreographed the aerial movement of Kong, and Kong isn't scenery. Like, he is moving across the stage. He's up and down in the air like an actor on the stage. And how long does it take to choreograph the puppet and also the people that control the puppet to move as one?
Yeah, well, I mean, we worked in Australia. We did several workshops on prototypes of Kong before we ended up with this version, and that was a very informative process where we worked originally with circus artists to try to find a way of rigging Kong and the points in which, you know, Kong is attached with marionette operation. That took trial and error, and we also had very talented circus artists that would have a knowledge of working with ropes and strings. And one of the things I think we're really proud of is the physical risk-taking that the performers involve with. They jump off Kong's shoulders at times and haul his arms into the air to swat the planes or to fight the serpent and this kind of thing. So we had a lot of exploration with highly trained physical performers and how that could intersect. And so then when we were in Melbourne, we worked for 6 months writing automation cues, and we have a really talented team, Richard Martin, who writes a lot of the automation programming, and we have it's the connection between automation, the animatronics that Sonny's created, the movement of Kong, and the confluence of all the performers' action that Lauren's a part of. So it took a lot of trial and error, and then there's moments where the voodoo and the movement of the head coincides with the movement of the shoulders, and then the placement of the hand, and that took months and months to create.
So and all of that is choreographed.
It's all
every
choreographed.
Little step and do it in order.
And everything has an impact. So the way in which the automation moves, the way in which the head moves, the way in which the shoulders, and then the placement of the elbow line, and all of these things. There's so many elements involved. And you can get it wrong very quickly, very easily. And so it's about the refinement of those things. And even now in the theatre, we're adjusting cues. There's a team in there kind of taking notes that Sonny and I've given to try to refine the movement of Kong even more. So, yeah.
So, Gavin and Sonny, is it worth you explaining a little bit about what Voodoo Technology is? Because, of course, it's the thing that delivers all of the emotion in Kong's face, and you've always talked about the importance of puppet breathing.
Yes, so it is an absolute combination of a whole bunch of, groups of people, if you like, and whilst much of it is automated, in terms of Kong's position on stage, and Kong is essentially suspended by what we call Kong's apparatus, which is this like a gantry crane above him, which has this disc which houses all the winches that hold his 2,000 pounds. That part of it, because of the safety aspect, is automated and pre-programmed. But The rest, 90% of it, is all live. And so it's that concert of all these live things coming together every night, and getting to that point where it's all working together to create this sense of one sentient being on stage. That's the beauty, I think, that, that we really, really enjoy bringing to the stage. But the voodoo aspect, we call it voodoo. There's guys, there's three puppeteers who operate all the internal functions of Kong. So Kong has a very expressive face. There's about 16 servos or motors in the face that deal with his expression. There's a bunch of hydraulic axes for the more powerful aspects within his body, shoulder shrugs and waist movements. There's even pneumatics in his wrists. We found, as a big marionette puppet, where I described before, you need lovely loose joints for them to be manipulated. When Kong would go up and do a chest beat in one of our prototypes, his wrists would flop around because they're out of the reach of the performers. It wasn't exactly powerful. So we have, again, it's all quite anatomical. We have these things called air muscles, which, a bit like tendons in your forearm, go around the wrist of Kong, and they can be tightened to make the wrist powerful, or loosened so the performers can manipulate them, and can flex and do a range of things like that. So there's a whole raft of different technologies. So we needed to find a way of controlling that sort of technology. And so we took a leaf out of the Walking with Dinosaurs project that we worked on, where we have these voodoo operators. And the name suggests, like whatever you do with a voodoo doll, the real thing does. So that's where it leaps from. And we've used it in film quite a bit. We didn't coin the name. But so there's three people that have these voodoo rigs, and John's one of them. And John specifically controls the neck of Kong. So the eye line of Kong, where Kong's looking. Danny controls the face, which is this mix of expressions. And Jacob...
Control it with like a joystick.
Yeah, they're custom controllers, so we try and make it as intuitive as possible. But we actually found it quite hard with Kong to make them match some sort of anatomy. So, yeah, to get on Danny's rig, which is... They all kind of look a bit like... Well, Danny's rig looks a bit like a machine gun. I don't know, it's
He does the face.
And he does the face, and so none of those things seem to line up. So you get on them and you're completely lost as to what you're controlling. So part of the challenge, I'm sure John will attest to, is breaking down all these complex moves and doing this isolation training, so that you know that whatever you're doing with the wrist here, which is controlling about 5 different functions, that you understand what you're doing.
I had a question for John. So there's 3 of you doing that. How do you work together, or do you work together? Or do you just know that you control the neck, so Kong has to move his neck, and then Danny knows how to move the face, or how does it work?
Well, we all have to definitely work together. Kong in himself is an ensemble piece. Mm-hmm. No one person can stand out. Really, you really have to work together. For example, like with doing the voice, there's about an 1/8 of a second delay from what I'm doing. So then Danny, who is to my right, can kind of hear and kind of anticipate what I'm about to do on stage, in essence. So then he can kind of create that. So
I assumed you did the facial expressions because you were doing the voice. So that's very interesting to me that someone else is doing the voice. And so when you do the scream, he then manipulates.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
The face, with so many servos and everything, I think it was such a complex thing that needs to kind of be focused on. That
also, John, the voice and the head really lead the intention of the puppet. So it's really important that John has those 2 things. So where the puppet looks and how it vocalizes is the lead for the other puppeteers, and really for the whole ensemble to understand what the brain of Kong is thinking. So those things kind of seem a bit odd to bunch together. And again, the face rig is so complex that to think about all those nuances in the face and do the voice, I think was probably going to be an overloading element for the puppeteers.
Mm-hmm. And how choreographed or scripted is the breathing and the roaring and the grunting that Kong does? Do you know at certain cues that you breathe or you grunt, or is it a new performance every night?
There are moments of improv that happen every night, because every night is different. That's the beauty of live theater. But a lot of the grunts and the growls, snarls, and roars are all scripted. He has lines just like any other actor mm-hmm. has in the script. And it's a mixture of almost having not only a script but also a score too, because you have to hit certain inflections and things like that. So it's half improv, half scripted.
And so, Lauren, you are part of the King's Company that control the movements of the arms, and so can you talk about a little bit your role specifically?
I bounce around a bit. I'm on his elbow, I'm on his right back foot, and I'm also a person that does some launching off of his back.
She does heroic launches.
Dun, dun, dun. For us as King's Company, it's really important to, obviously it's quite an ensemble piece. No one is more important than, anyone else. It's very much a group effort. And it's also like what we do is very much choreographed, but Kong feels like alive. He's alive, like alive on Broadway, like he really is alive on Broadway. And so it's choreographed, but there's also moments where maybe automation is delayed a little bit. So we always have to be like really on high alert and ready to be sort of flowing and to like adapt to what's actually happening live on stage, because it's not always the same. And so we have to have like our antenna on like high alert.
Yeah, and there's 10 of you.
There's 10 of us on stage.
And so do each of you, like you said, you do wrist and the elbow. Is it everyone split up amongst the different body parts? Can you switch roles, or does everyone know every part, or do you only know how to do the wrist?
For instance, there's 2 guys that do the paws, and they're pretty much set in that role. Same with the wrist gentlemen. They're basically just there. The back, we have the people on the feet and knees. We have a little bit more flexibility on like what we're doing. Like me and the other female that's in King's Company, we do a few different things, which is kind of nice because you get to know the creature even more. So there are some parts that are pretty stationary, and then a few of us bounce around and do a few different tasks on him.
And then are there understudies? Like if someone injures themselves, or like
definitely. We have 3 male swings in King's Company and 1 female swing. So they're amazing. And from the beginning, they were very much included. It was like a group effort. There's tackling this beast is quite an undertaking. And from the beginning, we were all hands-on and trying to get everyone as knowledgeable and like physical with the puppet as much as we can, because he's a beast.
And the set itself that Peter designed is also this moving, majestic piece as well. Like in the beginning of the story, the Empire State Building is growing amidst the Great Depression, and at the same time we see the character Ann Darrow, who's also trying to rise out of the ashes and make something of herself in the world. Can you talk about how the Empire State Building, that building and the city's architecture, how central that was to your design?
Can I just also point out that the King's Company don't just operate Kong, but they are the most amazing collection of dancers I've ever seen in my life. They also do all of the ensemble dancing, so it's a big night for them. It's amazing. As Sunny said, when we started working together, to do a show like this, to be literal and naturalistic on a stage, we would be scuttled. So we need to use all of the devices and, I suppose, imagination that theatre brings. And just as Kong is, in a way, something of a sketch of a giant gorilla in that it's not completely detailed, anatomically correct, as real as the experience that you feel that you've had when you see the show is, when you see that creature, he is sculptural and stylised. And I guess that's the same language that I've used for the show scenically. The building of the Empire State Building, I constantly am fascinated that architectural icon was built in 13 and a half months. I just find
During
it
the Great
amazing.
Depression.
Can't renovate a kitchen in that time. So the images of the metal workers, the steel workers, 1,000 feet up in the air hanging off I-beams and hooks, referred to as skywalkers at the time. There's something about those people at that height building that building in the midst of the Great Depression that I found really inspiring. And it sounds odd, but that's basically what New York City has become in this show. It's I-beams and cables. So Kong's got a lot of ropes and cables connected, and as does the set. The main parts of the New York City set, excuse me, are all, in a sense, marionette pieces themselves. We quote directly from those iconic images of the skywalkers hovering up in the air. In a way, we look at our journey from meeting Anne at the beginning to when we do sort of like have a nod to the building of the Empire State in the opening of the show. Our journey takes 13 and a half months. So at the end of the show, she climbs that building with Kong. I suppose the other thing to be said is the jungle part of it, and that I suppose is even more stylised and more imagined. It doesn't delve into forestry. It's much more a state of mind in a way. It's quite a surreal environment. It's got a hypnotic feel to it, but the visual language is all about vines. So again, we're referencing this idea of ropes, and there are characters who manipulate those vines. So again, we're just having this interaction between cast and physical objects in a way to puppetry the environment, to puppeteer Kong. And there's actually a time where there are some performers that are puppeteering our cast. So the cast that are manipulated through the jungle by the jungle. So we've got layers and layers and layers of that sort of rope and cable language. With the I-beams in New York, we're looking at the skeleton of a city. In a way, Kong also has he's got a beautiful climbing frame on his back, which has a skeletal feel. It kind of has a nice nod to the idea of a silverback gorilla being silver. But it's, I suppose, the aesthetic of this show is to describe things as simply as possible using lines and skeletal form to allow the audience's imagination to do the rest. The other big part of it is where we do lean on a much more recognisable visualisation is the projection content. So we have basically a semicircle LED screen that's like 90 feet long by almost 30 feet tall. So it's a big surface, and we create a lot of our environments and our sense of movement, Kong's movement through a space, a boat going through the ocean.
One of my favorite visuals, and that's including Kong in it, but one of my favorite moments was just the rocking of the boat in the beginning.
Yeah.
And it like the audience gasps, and that's even before they've seen Kong. It's just you made us feel like we were on this boat.
Yeah, I feel good about that moment.
Okay, good.
We got a good
He gets
boat.
a round of applause every night. It's very nice.
Yeah, and how much of that is the projection and your set, and then also the actors?
Actually, the projection's doing all the movement work there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the boat is designed to automate, and we do it once when we first leave the docks in New York City. But we found first of all, there's some physical realities that for cast dancing around as energetically as they are on a rocking platform is kind of a bit tough, given everything else they've got to do in the night. But really just the device of having a boat profile or silhouette shape, skeleton, and the moving footage behind it is enough to give you the sensation of movement. And then there are moments where choreographically there's an engagement with that movement as well. And certainly Kong, we take that to the extreme where if he goes running through an environment, we can support that with projection and accentuate his physical speed and dynamic using that device. And the projection, like the scenery, is also, whilst it's recognisable, it's intentionally quite painterly and stylised, and also, as pushed to the background as it can be when it needs to be, rather than being some sort of photographic, tour. Yeah.
Can I add something about the challenge of the jungle, which the question of aesthetic really preoccupied us for quite a long time, because in 1933, telling a story of a group of white people going to an island, and in that version of the story, Anne was captured by natives, and how you represent that idea and that kind of location in 2018 obviously was the topic of some thinking and debating from all of us. In the end, Jack Thorne decided he didn't want to have natives in this story, which was a relief to all of us because he felt he couldn't tell their story. And so the question became, how do you represent Skull Island in a satisfactory way in 2018? So for us, it became very much about an island that was, I think you used the word hypnotic, Pete, that it kind of vibrated of its own energy, where it had kind of sentient plants, and it's like the island's alive and has its own sort of kinesthetic energy, but there's no natives in this story. And so just the aesthetic of that, we often think of this story being told in 4 chapters. It's the New York of the 1930s, the boat journey at sea, Skull Island, and then all those elements returning with the adventurers to a different New York in chapter 4. But I thought the visual aesthetic of Skull Island was a very interesting challenge of this development as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I know when I watched it and I knew the story, and so I was wondering if there were going to be sort of like natives, and when you first see the vines, that's maybe what I thought they were. And it's really amazing how they designed it, and I don't know if the movement or if it was the choreography, but the vines literally, they're actors dressed as the vines, they're jumping on the actors and they're fighting them off like they would fight off a plant, and it's pretty powerful. And so then I realized, oh, this is the island. Like the island is the character, the island is the native, and it's really great.
Excellent. I'm glad you understood.
Yes.
But hopefully, for a modern audience, it just talks of nature. It talks of an idea of some sort of heart and ecology that is trashed, and that Kong sits at the throne of that environment. Yeah. And by taking Kong from that environment, you intrinsically, you take away its heart. And so I think we got to the point of thinking you don't need people to talk that idea of cultural imperialism, not to flog it, but just to sort of, put it out there. Mm-hmm. You don't go into these environments and take something out without, suffering the consequences.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask John, and the rest of you can too chime in, is the most compelling feature of Kong. His size is one thing, but it's really his eyes. And he's like these dark eyes and how expressive they are, and like his wonderment toward Anne, and then also his just sadness later when he's like trapped back in New York. And it's like, what do you feel is the anchor that connects the audience to Kong? Is it his eyes, or is it your voice, your breath?
I would say it's a mixture of both. I think the beauty of him is a lot of times people can look at him and it's whatever they're feeling is reflected back at them, especially in the eyes. And when the light hits the eyes just right, they kind of glisten, and you swear that they're moving and things. But that's, I think, a testament to the puppet and the testament to the show and the script. And yeah, sure, the voice has a little bit to do with that too, but no, I can't take full credit for that. But yeah, I think it's just what everyone has come together to make this fully realized character in a musical at that Kong is kind of really speaks to people.
And one of the things that's important when you're working with Kong is that he's constantly alive. A puppet can die very quickly on stage, and so the breath that's happening, through the movement, but also the facial expressions, the movement of the nose, the energy of the King's company on Kong, all of that really contributes to the sense that he's constantly thinking and feeling, and that's really important.
It's interesting that you said that a puppet can quickly die on stage, because you see him pretty early on when you get to Kong, to Skull Island, and I admittedly was kind of like, oh, they already showed him, but the amazement and wonderment never goes away, and I think that's because of that. Like, he feels alive on the stage, and you're just learning more about him throughout the rest of the show.
Yeah, and I think what I like about it is each scene refreshes our view of Kong. And the way Kong works with Peter's set, it's rarely do we repeat a position or a move of Kong throughout the whole show. So yeah, we do expose him relatively early, earlier than originally. It's evolved into seeing him earlier because I think that's what audiences wanted. But there's so many different variations in how we see him, and I think that's really important. And there's this of course his emotional arc as well, which just to add to John's comments about the face, the face is incredibly important, and we had some big decisions to make in terms of, okay, well, if we're embracing marionette puppetry, which is quite a traditional art form, well then marionette puppetry usually just has a jaw that might go up and down at most, so maybe a blinking set of eyes, but we were very keen to make sure that Kong was more than just a snarling beast with a set of teeth that might flash out every now and then. And so the expression was something that we thought was going to be very important from the start. So, and it kind of speaks to this idea, and it's not mine, but this idea that puppetry is an incredibly practical or pragmatic art form. And so all these choices of whether to use technology or humans or ropes and strings or a hydraulic cylinder, these are all very pragmatic decisions. And I think in the end, if they do the one thing, which is to create this breath and life in the puppet, then audiences will accept a sort of a grab bag, if you like, of different techniques, as long as this one creation is plausible at the end. And so the expression was one that we felt, well, I certainly felt quite comfortable about putting this layer of technology in. And I think it's really key to Kong's emotional story.
He has so much expression that I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Like, it truly was unbelievable, and it felt like it was, I'm so used to seeing CGI like on film, and that's what it seemed like. I was seeing CGI in real life. Like, it was just too realistic. It was really great.
For what it's worth, I think that the puppeteers on stage are the one ingredient that really gets that creature across the line as a stage puppet. And a lot of people see it and say, oh, why we're seeing puppeteers moving around. And a lot of people may have seen Warhorse, which was another great example of seeing puppeteers on stage. And there's a long tradition, Bunraku and Kabuki puppetry, where you see the puppeteers operating, and the magic of theatre where you forego that device and just surrender to the imagination, and that those puppeteers actually invest him with a spirit and a soul, not to get religious about it, but they're really, that contribution, I tell you, when you see, if you see the show, the curtain call moment, when they step forward, it's like an earthquake's going off. There's a great appreciation for what that device brings to that puppet.
There's one moment where Kong is like gassed, and the people controlling his paw, they lay his paw down, and then I saw that actor then himself do that, and I know it was all seamless, and you like you said, you accept it. So we have a question.
I just want to say I saw the show and was absolutely blown away, truly. And I did want to say that it almost felt interactive. The audience felt, it was like a communal feel. They gasped, they cried, they applauded all at the same time. And I thought it was phenomenal. I also saw Walking with Dinosaurs, which is cool. I didn't realize same team. Yeah, so great job. I don't have a question.
Oh, it's nice to hear from you. Thank you.
Do you have a question over here?
Yeah. So I also saw it, and I really enjoyed it. I loved the original movie, and I think that the show seemed very interested in like what made that movie powerful in a way that I don't feel like every adaptation of King Kong has. And one of the things I particularly enjoyed in it was the kind of collusion between Anne and Kong towards the end of it, right? Is like, you know, these scenes of like her like riding on his back as he's like rampaging through New York City, and kind of the the last song that sort of paints him as less of a victim and more as like the kind of messiah figure of some kind of liberation or something. And I was wondering if you could kind of comment on some of those like those new character choices, as well as like replacing Jack with like the Lenny, I think. So I don't know. I did some interesting things with the story, and I know none of you like wrote the book, I guess, but
You just said no one read the book. I've read that.
Wrote the-
Oh, right.
We didn't write the stage. No. I understand what you mean. Jack Thorne is not amongst us. Yeah, yeah. So, so it's a great question, because it's been probably the most central part of our thinking over the last 10 years, and it kind of goes back a little to my earlier point of why today, what can this story offer an audience in 2018? And of course, if you think about Ann Darrow, in 1933, she was a screaming blonde. Kong was just a scary monster. She was afraid of Kong. They didn't become friends. Later versions of the story, like the Peter Jackson film, they had a friendship. And And in that original story, it therefore made sense for there to be a character called Jack Driscoll, who was gallant and strong and a ship's first mate, and he could come and save her from the scary monster, and then they went off into the sunset together, and that felt like a very satisfying story. When we tried to include the character of Jack Driscoll in earlier iterations of the show, and this is before Jack Thorne, another Jack, joined us to adapt the book, we found that Jack Driscoll as a character was always irritating, because when Anne and Kong were together, you were interested in them and not really interested. It's just like, oh God, now he's here again. And then when Kong dies at the end, it also felt really awful that suddenly he walked out and embraced Anne. And again, you thought, oh, go away, I don't want to hear you say you love her. I mean,
I hope everyone knows the story of Kong. We've had so many spoilers.
Yeah. So, and then the bigger question for me over time, harder to answer, is what's Anne's victory at the end of this story? And what does it mean when you make a choice, again in 2018, to say that we want this to be Anne's story, we don't want this to be Carl Denham, the filmmaker's story, we want her to be front and centre, and we want her to be the focus. Well, every time you try to make the love interest matter and for us to care about that subplot of Anne and Jack Driscoll, it only took the focus off Anne, and it made it really hard to keep her front of the story. And I just thought in 2018, I want to have a female protagonist on stage that has a different victory to walking off in the sunset with a guy. She had to change in some way from the whole experience of knowing Kong. And so when I met up with Jack Thorne to ask him if he'd be interested in writing it, I put this to him and I said, part of me is terrified to even ask the question out loud. Is an audience going to want to see a musical where there's not the kind of romance or the kind of musical opportunities that a love interest offers you? You can imagine some gorgeous duet on the boat or at the end. Is it just going to be boring if it's about Anne and Kong? And he said, absolutely not. Like, let's never talk about it again. Jack Driscoll has gone. He complicates the story. He's superfluous. That's why he's struggling. And you'll find the storytelling just opens up and becomes really clear.
The real love story is between Anne and Kong, and she does have a beautiful ballad that she sings.
Yeah, it's a real friendship of two people who are misunderstood and two outsiders. So that was a really major moment in our development. It freed us up so much. And Jack had one other requirement that he was very specific about if he were to come on board as the book writer. He wanted this to be a tale of ambition, and he wanted Anne's ambition to be a factor in Kong's capture, because he wanted to see her fail in order for her to go on the journey and have this sort of victory of becoming a better person or a different person from the experience. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
That was great.
Can I just quickly follow up on a question about the show and your casting, and that if casting the lead as a woman of color was more about blind casting, and you're just like, we love her voice, we want her, or if it was to continue telling that story that you were just kind of illustrating.
Another great question, because of course this has been another very big part of our discussion, and I mentioned earlier our thinking about how one tells a story about an island with natives capturing someone in 2018, and the other piece of it was Kong does have a kind of history of alienating some sectors of the community. There's been a lot of thought, and you can easily find a lot of thought pieces about whether Kong represents the other, and that the whiteness in the story is represents goodness. And so we were interested to subvert that. We didn't, the question of colourblind casting is very topical in our industry at the moment, and I find we often talk more now about colour conscious casting, and I know Drew McOnie, the director, felt very strongly when we talked about the piece that we wanted it to be a show that made everybody welcome and that didn't alienate anyone in the audience. And to that end, it wasn't about just saying, oh, let's make sure that Anne's just cast as a woman of colour. It was about really making sure there was a level of diversity through the whole company, and that the company we put together reflects a contemporary audience and society today. So that was important choice through the whole piece. We auditioned a number of women, of course, for Anne, And we had a number of other, actually women of colour do previous workshops for us. But the casting choice itself ultimately was based on the person we thought was the best for the role. But we really did cast our net very wide, and it was a very conscious choice to do so because we wanted to reflect something back to a modern audience that looks more like the society we live in. And we felt very strongly about that choice.
Thank you so much, and thank you all of you for coming, and thank you for coming. And I think we have to wrap it up here.